Hey guys, tonight we will delve into one of the most thrilling and tragic cases in the history of the English monarchy. The story of Anne Boleyn, the queen who lost her crown after just 17 fateful days. Every year, on the 19th of May, a bouquet of red roses is delivered to the Tower of London, the resting place of Anne Boleyn, the captivating and mysterious second wife of King Henry VIII. This is a silent ritual, reminding us of the swift, sudden downfall of a queen. From the height of power, in just 17 days, she was arrested, accused of adultery and incest with close allies such as courtier Henry Norris, musician Mark Smeaton, and even her own brother, George Boleyn, culminating in a swift trial and the death sentence. I will join you in uncovering the cruel political machinations, especially the role of Thomas Cromwell, the cold architect behind this destruction, to find out the truth behind those horrific accusations. Was Anne Boleyn truly a traitor, or merely a victim of a political chess game demanding a male heir? Tonight, we will retrace each fragment, each step, each whispered accusation, to uncover what was truth and what was manipulation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we begin, let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Every year, on the 19th of May, when the early London breeze slips through the old stone walls of the tower, a quiet ritual takes place as if time itself cannot erase it. A bouquet of red roses with no card, no name, no message, is delivered to the chapel inside the tower. The only instruction left behind is simple. Place the flowers exactly where Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was buried in the year 1536. Under the faint light that filters through the small window, the red petals rest against the cold stone, reminding us of a story nearly 5 centuries old, a story that still causes a subtle shiver whenever it is recalled. That story, no matter how many times it is retold, still carries the suffocating weight of 17 fateful days, 17 days that transformed a queen from the height of power into a condemned prisoner, standing before the executioner's blade. In the final 3 days of her life, Anne faced 3 unimaginable milestones: being arrested, being put on trial, and finally stepping onto the scaffold. But before reaching that end, we must return to the first of those days, the last day of her freedom, the day when every door around her began to close, slowly and silently, so quietly that she could not recognize her life had already turned toward its end. On that day, for the first time in the entire history of England, a reigning queen was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. What shocked people was not merely the charges, but the sheer suddenness of it all. A morning that seemed no different from any other, with voices echoing along the Thames, with merchant boats bustling since dawn became the beginning of a tragedy that could never be undone. Anne Boleyn, the woman whom Henry had once loved so fiercely that he abandoned a marriage of 24 years with Catherine of Aragon, now stood at the center of accusations almost beyond belief: adultery, incest, and treason. Each of those crimes, if proven, carried the same final punishment, death. But what made that day so heavy was the silence surrounding Anne. There were no warnings, no whispers of danger, no hints of the storm that had already formed over her head. Anne was still a queen, still holding the highest title a woman could possess, still standing above every woman in the realm. Yet that power had already begun to dissolve like mist on cold stone, disappearing without sound, without shape. From the vantage point of history, we can clearly see how each event followed another like pieces of a game, set long before she walked into it. But for Anne, the truth arrived too quickly, tearing the curtain away from a stage still brightly lit. She did not know that the accusations had been prepared in advance. She did not know that others were counting the minutes until she could no longer escape. And she certainly did not know that, even on that very day, every gaze directed toward her no longer held admiration, but a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The 19th of May, in the year 1536, the date marked by the yearly bouquet of roses, is the end of that journey. But it began on the day Anne had not yet understood she was stepping toward her final hours. It was the last day she carried the title of queen without bowing her head to anyone. The last day she could walk freely through her palace halls without being watched. The last day she still believed Henry's love might save her, as it once had, from the world's harshest judgments. And only in hindsight do we see that the silence of that morning was the first omen, a whisper of the tragedy that would cast its shadow over English history for centuries to come. On Tuesday morning, the 2nd of May, in the year 1536, at 8 o'clock, London had already been awake for 3 full hours. The streets were crowded with merchants calling out their wares, with travellers and clerks weaving through the morning bustle. Along the river, the Thames was thick with boats, their hulls heavy with goods, their decks crowded with men beginning another day of labour. Nothing about the city hinted at the quiet tremor beginning to form behind palace walls, nothing that might betray the shift in fate approaching a queen. Inside Whitehall Palace, one of nearly 60 royal residences owned by the king, everything appeared comfortingly ordinary. The kitchens burned with the heat of roasting meat. Copper pots hissed softly. Servants moved with the steady rhythm of routine, preparing the main meal that Henry expected each day. At this moment in his life, Henry was not yet the swollen, immobile figure history often imagines. He was still strong, active, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed time itself must obey him. His legs carried his weight without complaint, his appetite had not yet become a burden, and his temper, though sharp, had not yet fully hardened into the cold steel it would later become. But this morning, Henry had already completed a task of far greater consequence than any meal that would be placed before him. From within Whitehall, he had sent a message eastward, an instruction dispatched with quiet urgency, carried by a royal messenger whose steps would unknowingly alter the course of English history. The note was brief, without decoration, without warmth. Yet its meaning, once delivered, would begin the unravelling of a queen. Leaving Whitehall, the messenger made his way toward the Thames, boarded a boat, and began the journey east along the river. The water was dark and restless beneath the oars, reflecting the grey morning sky. As the boat slipped past the city's timbered houses and stone walls, the messenger held the king's sealed instruction close, unaware of the weight resting in the fold of parchment. His destination was Greenwich, specifically, the Grand Palace of Placentia, where Anne Boleyn was staying. Palace of Placentia, whose name meant the Pleasant Palace, rose gently along the riverside. For Anne, it had always been a place of comfort, a place she loved more deeply than any other royal residence. Its halls were wide, its gardens green and sprawling, its rooms bright with tapestries and sunlight. She had walked those corridors as queen, as wife, as mother. But today, the palace would offer her none of its usual softness. The Pleasant Palace would fail to live up to its name. While London's crowds moved with the steady rhythm of commerce and life, something else was stirring behind the walls of power. Something quiet, deliberate, and cold. A plan was being woven, thread by thread, by minds that had already decided the future of Anne Boleyn. It grew in silence, unseen by the servants who scrubbed the floors, unheard by the women preparing gowns or arranging meals. It formed in the shadowed corridors where whispers travelled farther than footsteps. That plan, carefully hidden beneath the surface of royal routine, was aimed directly at the Queen. As the messenger travelled closer to Greenwich, the distance between Anne and her fate shrank with each pull of the oars. She did not know that a river she often travelled for pleasure was, today, carrying toward her the first sign of disaster. She did not know that Henry's message would mark the beginning of the end. She did not know that the palace she found so comforting would soon become the setting of her fear. By the time the messenger stepped ashore at Placentia, London was alive with noise, heat, and movement. Markets opened their canopies, horses stamped against the cobblestones, and the bells of distant churches marked the hour. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed unchanged. But beneath the surface, beneath the clatter and chatter of ordinary life, destiny had already begun its slow descent upon Anne Boleyn, quiet as a whisper, steady as the tide. And in that quiet, the plan against the Queen continued to take form, unnoticed by the world outside. That morning, Anne began her day by watching a game of real tennis, a sport beloved by both her and Henry, a pastime they had often enjoyed together in gentler, lighter years. She stood by the edge of the court, the movements of the players reflected faintly in her eyes, unaware that this quiet moment would be one of her last before the world shifted beneath her feet. Among the courtiers of England, Anne had always been impossible to overlook. Stylish in her dress, sharp in her wit, magnetic in her presence, she was a woman who carried within her the elegance of French courts, the confidence of a well-educated mind, and a spirit shaped by the many storms she had weathered in her 35 years of life. Anne had been born in England, but sent at a young age to France, where she served in the households of noblewomen and queens. There, she absorbed the language, the poise, the refined manners of a world far more polished than many English courts of her youth. When she returned to England, she entered the service of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, a woman who had reigned beside him for more than 20 years. It was there, in the familiar rhythm of court life, that Henry's eyes first found Anne. A glance became curiosity. Curiosity deepened into desire, and desire evolved into an obsession strong enough to fracture his kingdom. What followed was a journey that reshaped an entire nation. Henry pursued Anne relentlessly, writing letters filled with longing, promising a future where she would be queen. To make that future possible, he sought an annulment from Catherine, a process that stretched on for years, strained England's relationship with Rome, and eventually led to the birth of a separate English church. All for Anne. All because he believed that she was the woman chosen for him by fate itself. They had been married for 3 years now. 3 years in which Anne had stood beside him as queen, not merely as consort but as a partner in politics, a figure of influence and ambition. Together, they had a daughter, a bright, red-haired child named Elizabeth. No one yet knew that this small girl would one day become Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs. For now, she was simply a cherished child, kept safely away in her own household, unaware that her mother's fate was beginning to tremble like a candle in the wind. But on this particular morning, Anne watched the tennis match alone. The absence beside her, the absence of Henry, was more telling than any words could have been. Only the day before, during the May Day festivities, something had happened. Some news, whispered urgently into the king's ear, had unsettled him so deeply that he abandoned the celebration without warning. He mounted his horse and rode back to Whitehall with haste, leaving Anne behind at Greenwich, surrounded by festivities that suddenly felt hollow. She had been left to manage the court's confusion, to mask her own concern with practiced grace, even as an unease she could not name settled into her thoughts. Now, as she watched the ball arc and spin across the court, Anne tried to distract herself with the familiar excitement of the game. She enjoyed betting lightly on matches, a harmless pleasure that amused those around her. And according to those who later recounted the scene, she was in the middle of lamenting a missed wager, regretting not having placed a bet on the player, who ultimately won when the king's messenger appeared at the edge of the court. The sight of him, dressed in the colours of royal service, carrying a sealed instruction, shifted the air around her. The noise of the match seemed to dull, the player's movements suddenly distant. The messenger bowed, waiting for her attention, and extended the king's order. This was the moment the thread of her life began to pull apart. A simple message, delivered in the quiet of a spring morning at Greenwich, marking the beginning of a chain of events that would grow darker with each passing hour. Anne could not know it then, but this was the first step toward the end, the unseen beginning of the 17 days that would strip her of her crown, her freedom, and finally her life. And as she accepted the message, the echo of yesterday's unease returned, soft but insistent, like a shadow stretching slowly across the floor. The message from Whitehall reached Greenwich by river, carrying with it an instruction that was brief, cold, and unmistakably final. By order of the king, Queen Anne was to present herself before the Privy Council at Greenwich. Anne understood at once what this meant. The Privy Council was the most powerful advisory body in the realm. No summons from them was trivial. Her heart must have grown heavy, as if a weight had settled quietly upon her chest. Something was wrong deeply, irrevocably wrong. From the tennis court, where moments earlier she had been watching the game with mild amusement, she was escorted across the palace courtyard. The brightness of the morning seemed to fade as she walked, surrounded by guards, under the watchful eyes of courtiers who whispered behind gloved hands. With every step toward the council chamber, Anne felt the world tighten around her. Perhaps, in that long walk, the shadow of an old fear stirred the fear, once carried by Catherine of Aragon. Was Henry going to cast her aside? Had she failed him in some way she could not yet understand? She searched her thoughts desperately, trying to grasp what misstep could have led to this moment. But no answer came. Only the cold stone beneath her feet and the soft echo of her own uncertainty kept her company as she approached the chamber door. Inside, 3 men rose to their feet when she entered. The first was the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle by blood, yet a man who had never cared for her, whose ambition outweighed any sense of family loyalty. Beside him stood William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower of London, a man whose very presence signalled danger. For the Tower was rarely invoked, except in matters of grave seriousness. The third was another member of the council, stern-faced and silent. Anne later recounted that Norfolk greeted her with the words, "Tut, tut," a mild rebuke on the surface, almost too small for such an occasion. But what followed shattered any illusion that this was a mere reprimand. They informed her plainly, without softness, without hesitation, that she was accused of adultery. Not a single accusation, but several. She had supposedly committed adultery with Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's closest friends and most trusted attendants. She was accused as well of lying with Mark Smeaton, a court musician of common birth, and there was mention of a third man, unnamed, shadowed, adding an even darker edge to the charges. It was a cascade of accusations designed to overwhelm, to tarnish, to crush. For Anne, the blow must have seemed unreal, as if the room itself had tilted. To be accused of adultery was already a grave matter, but to be accused of it with the king's dearest companion, and with a musician far below her station, pierced not only her honour, but her sense of reality. The world she knew, the world she had fought for, began to come apart, thread by thread. Yet even in that moment of shock, Anne held herself with a stillness, born of pride and survival. She steadied her voice and declared that she was the king's true wife, untouched by any other man. She insisted that her body and her loyalty had remained solely Henry's. It was instinct, perhaps the reflex of someone who had learned long ago that in court life, composure was armour, and denial was the first line of defence. But behind that composure, there must have been a tremor, faint but growing. For Anne could see, in the faces before her, that this was no misunderstanding, no fleeting suspicion. Something larger had been set in motion, something planned, deliberate, and merciless. And though she did not yet know it, this moment was the beginning of a descent from which she would never rise again. After the confrontation, Anne was escorted back to her private chambers, forced once more to cross the palace courtyard, beneath the gaze of onlookers, a humiliation no queen in England had ever endured. The sunlight on the stones, the whisper of silk, the shifting shapes of servants around her, everything seemed too bright, too sharp, as if the world itself were watching her fall from grace. When she finally stepped back into her rooms at Greenwich, armed guards positioned themselves discreetly, yet unmistakably near the doors. Even so, Anne tried to cling to the remnants of normalcy. It was midday, and she sat down for her usual meal, attempting to follow the rhythms of an ordinary day, as though routine might steady the trembling edges of her world. She wore a gown of deep red velvet and cloth of gold, the heavy fabric settling around her with the weight of ceremony. Above her, as always, hung the canopy of estate, the symbol of a queen's authority. But today, that symbol felt strangely hollow, almost mocking, like a reminder of a throne already beginning to slip from beneath her. The table before her glittered with polished silver, yet the room felt colder than it had ever been. Around her, the atmosphere shifted in ways she could feel, even if no one spoke of it. Her ladies moved quietly, their faces pale and eyes swollen, as though they had already begun mourning something that had not yet happened. Their silence pressed upon Anne more heavily than words ever could. The most unsettling sign, however, came in the form of an absence. The king's server, who traditionally arrived before each meal to offer the formal blessing, "May this do you much good," did not appear. It was a small ritual, but rituals hold meaning, and its disappearance struck Anne like a whisper of doom. She tried to eat. She tried to breathe steadily, to maintain the dignity expected of a queen. But the tremor within her grew stronger, loosening the fragile composure she fought to keep. Slowly, the illusion of normality crumbled around her. Her meal, her gown, her canopy, all symbols of royal life, sat unchanged. Yet the world beneath them had shifted irreversibly. But none of this had come from nowhere. Trouble had begun 3 months earlier, during a moment that should have been one of hope. Anne had been pregnant with a son, or so many believed. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had fallen apart after nearly 24 years without a surviving male heir. The continuation of the Tudor line depended entirely upon a prince. Anne had known this. She had felt the pressure with every passing month. This child could secure her place, silence her enemies, and fulfill the promise Henry had torn a nation apart to pursue. In anticipation of the birth, she commissioned a commemorative medal titled "The Most Happy." Its purpose was clear. Once her son arrived, these medals would spread across the kingdom as a triumphant declaration of her success, of divine favour, of the legitimacy of her reign. The prototype, the only surviving one, was later preserved in the British Museum. It was a small object, yet it held within it the weight of Anne's highest hopes. But then came the tragedy. Anne miscarried. And according to those closest to her, the lost child appeared to be a boy. In that single moment, all her hopes and Henry's desperate dreams slipped away like sand through open fingers. It was a devastating blow, not only to Anne as a mother, but to her position as queen. For Henry, it resurrected an old fear, one he had carried through the long years with Catherine, that God might be denying him a son. And if God refused a son, then perhaps God refused the marriage itself. Rumours spread swiftly, as they always did in court. Whispers drifted through the corridors that Henry had begun to consider taking another wife. Some said he spoke of it openly. Others swore he avoided Anne's presence, slipping away rather than facing her disappointment. Whether the whispers were true hardly mattered. What mattered was that people believed them. And in the fragile architecture of royal power, belief was everything. For Anne, the miscarriage was not merely a personal sorrow. It was a disaster that shook the foundation of her queenship. It weakened her in the eyes of the king, emboldened her enemies, and left her vulnerable in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Now, as she sat beneath the canopy of estate, surrounded by silence and sorrow, she felt the consequences of that moment more sharply than ever. The loss of her child had been the crack in the glass. Today, it began to break. After the loss of the pregnancy, Henry began to think seriously about setting Anne aside and finding another wife who might finally give him a son. The disappointment had lodged itself deeply in him, stirring old fears he thought he had buried along with his first marriage. And when a Tudor king allowed doubt to settle, it was only a matter of time before that doubt became action. At this moment, another figure stepped forward into the dim light of politics, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, the son of a blacksmith, had risen with astonishing speed to become the king's most trusted and most formidable adviser. He had done so by promising Henry something few men could offer: the chance to become the richest and most powerful sovereign ever to rule England. Cromwell understood money, influence, and the delicate balance of power better than almost anyone at court. He had been the architect behind Henry's separation from Catherine of Aragon, pulling political strings with a ruthless precision that left even his allies wary. And now, as Henry's affection for Anne waned, Cromwell shifted his allegiance with the same cold efficiency. The Queen, who had once been protected by his strategies, was now the target of them. For several weeks, Cromwell had been working quietly from his residence at Austin Friars, a place that had become the beating heart of Tudor politics. The building, surrounded by the restless hum of London's clerks, merchants, and lawyers, seemed an unlikely birthplace for a royal tragedy. Yet behind its doors, Cromwell constructed the case that would undo Anne Boleyn. His method was slow, careful, deliberate. Nothing was left to chance. Every whisper, every rumour, every doubtful glance exchanged in the corridors of power became a thread he could weave into the net, tightening around the Queen. If Cromwell had been born centuries later, some might have called him a political strategist, a master of narrative, or a manipulator of public opinion. But in his own time, he was something even more dangerous: a man who viewed politics as a chessboard, with the king as both the most valuable piece and the most unpredictable. To keep the king strong, others could be sacrificed without hesitation. Cromwell believed utterly in a simple principle that any path was justified if it led to the desired end. And the end he pursued now was not subtle. Henry did not merely want to distance himself from Anne. He wanted to be free of her entirely. A quiet annulment might have been possible months earlier, but after years of fierce controversy, after reshaping England's religious identity, Anne's removal required something cleaner, something final. Cromwell understood that if he failed, if he miscalculated even slightly, the punishment would not be political exile but death. The axe that might fall upon Anne could just as easily fall upon him, so he moved decisively. His first step had already been set in motion, placing Anne before the Privy Council, confronting her with accusations that struck at the core of her identity as queen and wife. From there, he expanded outward. Each day brought new layers to the case, new claims, new names whispered into the record. Cromwell gathered testimonies from those who feared him, from those who hated Anne, and from those who simply wished to protect themselves. Each statement, no matter how thin or questionable, became another stone in the structure he was building. The allegations were shocking by design. Adultery was a severe charge for any woman, but for a queen, for the mother of a potential heir, it was treason. Cromwell understood that the more sensational the accusations, the more easily they would be believed by a court already growing weary of Anne's sharp wit and political presence. So he shaped the narrative with meticulous care. Anne had supposedly betrayed the king with Sir Henry Norris. She had supposedly lowered herself to lie with Mark Smeaton, a common musician, and somewhere in the shadows lingered the idea of a third man, unnamed, feeding the fire of suspicion. Cromwell did not need the accusations to be true. He only needed them to be convincing. In private, he calculated every angle. In public, he moved like a shadow. His influence seeped into every corner of court life. Men who had once spoken with admiration about Anne now held their tongues. Women who had once envied her now whispered nervously behind closed doors. Everywhere, there was a sense of tightening, as though the palace itself sensed that something irreversible was approaching. And Cromwell, with the quiet patience of a man who knew the stakes better than anyone, continued to pull the threads. Piece by piece, step by careful step, he advanced the plan to remove the Queen of England, a plan that, once set fully in motion, no one would be able to stop. When Anne finished her anxious meal at Greenwich, Cromwell was already prepared to take the next step. From Austin Friars, he crossed the city toward the Palace of Placentia with deliberate purpose. Inside the Queen's dining chamber, Anne sat beneath the regal canopy of estate, doing her best to maintain a calm she no longer truly felt. Her gown shimmered softly in the dim light, but beneath the velvet and gold, her heartbeat must have trembled like a trapped bird. The silence of the room broke when Cromwell entered with a retinue of important figures, their faces solemn, their pace steady. At the front of the group stood the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle, yet never her ally. Earlier that very morning, Norfolk had been one of the 3 Privy Council members who confronted Anne with accusations of adultery. Now he returned, but this time holding a rolled parchment in his hand. The sight of the seal, the weight of the document, was unmistakable. It was an arrest warrant. In the world of the Boleyns, blood had never been thicker than power, and here stood the clearest proof. Norfolk's loyalty belonged not to his niece, but to the king whose favour sustained him. Anne rose from her seat, her posture instinctively graceful, despite the storm gathering around her. She asked why they had come, a question she likely already feared the answer to. Norfolk did not soften his voice. He did not shield her with courtesy. Instead, he spoke plainly. "We come by the king's command to conduct the Queen to the Tower of London." The words must have struck her like a physical blow, a cold fist closing around her stomach. The Tower of London was no mere residence. It was the place where traitors awaited judgment, where the accused confronted the end of all hope. And yet, even as the meaning washed over her, Anne held herself with dignity. She replied that if it was His Majesty's pleasure, then she would obey. It was the response of someone who understood the danger of resisting, someone who still believed, however faintly, that innocence might yet shield her. But there was no mercy in the procedures that followed. Anne was given no time to gather her belongings, no time to summon her ladies, who had always been by her side, no time even to embrace her daughter, the little Elizabeth, then only 2.5 years old. The abruptness was cruel, but it was intentional. Cromwell knew Henry and Anne too well, knew the fire in their quarrels and the passion in their reconciliations. They were capable of raging at each other in one moment and clinging fiercely the next. If Henry saw her again before the machinery of accusation fully settled into place, there was a chance he might falter, a chance he might forgive her, a chance the plan would unravel. Cromwell could not risk that. So haste became a weapon sharp, swift, and merciless. Every minute that passed was another stitch in the net tightening around Anne. She was escorted out of the chamber, stripped not of her gown or her jewels, but of her freedom, which had been taken even more quickly than her crown would be. Guards fell into formation beside her, as though she were already convicted, though no trial had yet occurred. The corridors she had once walked as queen now seemed longer, colder. Servants, who once bowed deeply, now watched in frozen silence. Doors that once opened gladly before her seemed heavy, reluctant. The palace itself felt as though it were withdrawing its loyalty. From that moment, Anne Boleyn was no longer treated as a sovereign. She was a prisoner. There was nothing left to do except wait for the boat that would carry her down the Thames, the same river she had travelled triumphantly 3 years earlier for her coronation celebration. Then, she had been greeted by cheers, by banners fluttering in sunlight, by music that echoed across the water. Now she would travel in silence, toward the most feared fortress in the kingdom. The Tower of London awaited her, and with each passing moment, the distance between her life as queen and her fate as an accused traitor grew smaller, narrower, darker. Anne, who had once commanded a nation's attention, now stood on the edge of a journey that no crown could save her from. While Anne remained under guard, waiting for the river journey that would carry her toward the Tower of London, an entirely different picture unfolded at Whitehall, the palace where Henry was staying. There, the mood did not echo fear or grief or even solemnity. Instead, it seemed almost celebratory, as though a great weight had been lifted from the king's shoulders. Henry avoided facing his wife, avoided the tension at Greenwich, avoided the whispers beginning to spread across the capital. He did not wish to see Anne, nor did he wish the public to read anything in his expression. Yet for the few who caught glimpses of him during those hours, a peculiar detail surfaced again and again. The king appeared to be in excellent spirits. Some said he looked relieved. Others described him as cheerful, even buoyant. At court, where decorum and restraint often stifled emotion, such visible lightness shocked those who witnessed it. The palace shifted into an unexpectedly festive atmosphere. Feasts sprang up one after another, cups clinked late into the night, and laughter loud, unguarded laughter filtered through the corridors. To many, it felt indecent, almost cruel. The Queen, still holding her title, was being accused of crimes that could lead to death. Yet the king seemed unbothered, even invigorated. Reports from courtiers at the time tell a similar tale. Henry, they said, dined frequently with noble women, sometimes staying out with them until well past midnight. The image of a grieving or conflicted husband was entirely absent. Instead, Henry behaved like a man who had already closed a chapter of his life and was eager to begin another. In his mind, Anne seemed to belong firmly to the past, a former passion already cooling, fading, evaporating like mist under the sun. What made this transformation even more unsettling was the memory of how deeply Henry had once loved her. Barely a few years earlier, he had pursued Anne with a desperation that bent the world around them. His desire had broken a 24-year marriage, triggered England's break with Rome, and set off religious and political shockwaves across Europe. He had risked his legitimacy as king, challenged the Pope, and redefined the English Church all for her. That the man capable of such devotion could now celebrate her downfall revealed something chilling about Henry's nature. His love, like his anger, could reshape kingdoms. His heart was a force of destruction as much as creation. This led many to ask, what was it about Anne that once held him so tightly? Portraits painted after her death often idealized or distorted her features. Some artists softened her expression, while others hardened it, projecting their own interpretations onto her story. Because of this, historians struggled to know precisely what Anne looked like. The only reliable likeness was the face engraved on the Most Happy Medal, the commemorative piece created during her pregnancy 3 months earlier. It was the only portrait confirmed to have been made during her lifetime, a rare fragment of truth among centuries of myth-making. Studying that medal, one sees a woman not traditionally beautiful by later standards, yet striking in a way that transcends simple appearance. Her eyes appear steady, deep, almost knowing. Her posture conveys confidence, perhaps even defiance. It is the face of someone who believed fully in her own worth, a quality that had captivated Henry at a time when he was desperate for validation, admiration, and challenge. Yet here he was now, indulging in revelry while she sat alone under guard, awaiting judgment. His swift emotional shift from passion to rejection revealed a painful truth about the volatility of his affections. Henry's love had always been intertwined with power, ego, and desire. When those currents changed direction, his heart followed without looking back. At Whitehall, the music played on. Guests drank and danced, pretending not to notice the tension humming beneath the festivities. Some may have suspected what was coming, others perhaps said nothing out of fear, but all could see that the king had already moved on in spirit, if not yet in law. Henry's light-heartedness, so starkly contrasted with Anne's isolation, highlighted not only the fragility of her position but also the danger of being loved by a man whose emotions ruled a kingdom. The king's joy was a warning, a quiet announcement that Anne Boleyn's story, once ablaze with passion and promise, was drawing toward its final, irreversible end. While Anne was being guarded and prepared for departure, the scene at Whitehall where Henry remained could not have been more different. The king kept his distance, avoiding any encounter with his wife, and he made no appearance before the public despite the spreading rumours that clung to the air like mist. Yet those few courtiers who did catch sight of him during these critical hours reported something that felt strangely out of place. Henry appeared cheerful. More than cheerful, he seemed almost delighted by the unfolding fate of Anne. Within the palace walls, this unsettling mood translated into an atmosphere of celebration. The court, which might have been expected to fall into tense silence, instead grew lively. Banquets and feasts followed one another in rapid succession. Music drifted through the halls. Laughter loud, careless, thoughtless, echoed in chambers where diplomacy and restraint typically ruled. Many who witnessed this behavior found it disturbing, even unbecoming. How could a king rejoice while his queen faced accusations that could cost her life? How could he seem so untouched by the unraveling tragedy? Witnesses observed that Henry frequently dined with ladies of the court, surrounding himself with their attention and flattery. On some nights, he stayed with them until after midnight, indulging in conversation, wine, and entertainment. His enthusiasm, his ease, his almost boyish energy, all hinted at a mind that had already placed Anne behind him. Her downfall, her fear, her tears inside Greenwich seemed to have no echo in his world at Whitehall. This transformation was shocking when one remembered the past. Years earlier, Henry had risked everything for Anne, not only the stability of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which had lasted nearly 24 years, but the unity of the Church in England. His pursuit of Anne had fractured ties with Rome, ignited political storms across Europe, and reshaped the religious life of an entire kingdom. All for her. All because he claimed to love her beyond reason. And now? Now he celebrated. It was this contrast, this abrupt shift from passion to indifference, that startled many at court and continues to puzzle historians. How could a man who had once written letters filled with longing and devotion now greet the charges against Anne with feasts? How could he listen to accusations of adultery with such eagerness, when he had once nearly torn his realm apart to possess her? To understand this contradiction, one might look again at the early days of their love. Yet even here, clarity fades. Later portraits often blur or exaggerate Anne's features, leaving behind an image shaped more by myth than by truth. Some portray her as a great beauty, others as merely striking or unusual. The only trustworthy evidence of her appearance lies in the most happy medal, the sole likeness created while she was alive, commissioned in hopeful anticipation of the birth of her son. On that medal, Anne appears dignified, poised, and undeniably confident. Her eyes are steady, her posture upright. There is strength in her expression, the strength of a woman who believed in her place beside the king. Henry, captivated by her wit, her intelligence, and her refusal to yield, had found in Anne something different from Catherine, something vibrant, something challenging. But Henry was not a man whose affections stayed steady for long. His passion, once bright and consuming, could dim just as quickly. When disappointed, when confronted with loss, with frustration, with the absence of a male heir, his heart hardened and his gaze shifted. The very intensity that had once lifted Anne to the throne now turned against her. Thus, the feasts, the laughter, the late-night gatherings were not merely displays of pleasure. They were evidence of a king who had already removed Anne from the centre of his world. Evidence that, in his mind, she no longer stood as queen, or wife, or beloved. She existed now only as a problem to be solved, a chapter to be closed. Henry's rapid emotional turn, from devotion to dismissal, revealed the precariousness of life beside a king who wielded both love and power with equal volatility. It illustrated how swiftly affection could be replaced by calculation, and how easily a queen could slip into the shadows once she no longer served the future he envisioned. In the revelry of Whitehall, hidden beneath music and candlelight, lay the quiet truth. Anne Boleyn was already a memory to Henry, and memories, in his world, were not worth saving. Returning to the present moment of the year, 1536, Anne had been waiting at Greenwich for nearly 1 full hour for the boat that would take her away. The delay pressed upon her like a weight, giving her far too much time to feel the palace fading from her grasp. She was about to leave her beloved residence for the final time, drifting down the Thames toward the Tower of London, a journey she had once taken in triumph, but now would take in chains, at least in spirit. Ordinarily, prisoners sent to the Tower travelled under cover of darkness. It was the custom to escort them quietly, discreetly, shielding the process from public eyes. But for Anne, the pattern was reversed. Cromwell intended her arrest to be a spectacle. He wanted her humiliation illuminated by daylight. And so the Queen was brought forth in the open, under the bright sky, her every step watched, her every breath weighed, her entire fall displayed like theatre. Cromwell himself boarded the vessel with her. His presence was not ceremonial, it was strategic. He trusted no one else with the task of guarding Anne. He needed to ensure she did not speak to Henry, did not sway anyone with her charm or eloquence, did not somehow find a path back to favour. His eyes must have remained fixed on her, steady and cold, as though she were already condemned. The air on the boat must have been thick with silence. Anne, surrounded by men who once bowed before her, now found herself watched as if she were dangerous, guilty, contaminated by treason. Her attendants were not her friends, they were witnesses. Her guards were not protectors, they were reminders of her fall. Yet outside the boat the world was loud. Cromwell's agents had already spread word along the river banks. The Queen had been arrested, the Queen was being transported, the Queen was heading to the Tower. By the time the boat pushed away from the Greenwich dock, whispers had begun to ripple along both shores. As the vessel passed under bridges and beside wharves, crowds gathered to stare. Some pointed, some murmured prayers. Many shook their heads with satisfaction, believing Anne had stolen the place that rightfully belonged to Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, the true wife, in their eyes. The Thames was bustling that afternoon. It was a busy route, crowded with merchant boats bringing goods, ferries carrying workers, private barges gliding toward the city. But one barge drew every eye, the one carrying the Queen, stripped of her power. People leaned forward to see her face, hoping to catch some expression of despair, arrogance, or guilt, anything, to confirm their beliefs about her. Hatred and curiosity mixed in the river air. The journey lasted about 2 hours. 2 hours in which Anne could do nothing but sit and feel the weight of the river pulling her toward the place where her fate would be sealed. 2 hours in which the sound of water striking the hull echoed like a slow drum, marking time she could not stop. 2 hours in which the world watched and judged her from the shore. At last, the Tower appeared rising from the water with its cold, impenetrable walls, its towers glinting under the pale light. Seen from the river, it was even more imposing, a fortress built to inspire fear. Anne would have known its reputation intimately. The Tower was a royal palace, yes, but it was also a prison for traitors, a place where many walked in but far fewer walked out. Most prisoners entered through Traitor's Gate, the dark archway that opened directly into the fortress from the river. But Anne was spared that final indignity. Whether out of lingering respect for her title, or a calculated effort to maintain an image of fairness, her guards took her to Court Gate instead, the entrance used for nobles and persons of high rank. It was, in its own way, a gesture that acknowledged she was still, on paper, Queen of England. When Anne stepped onto the shore, she had barely touched solid ground before the Tower's cannons boomed. The thunder rolled across the water, startling birds into flight. The sound could have been interpreted as a salute, a recognition of her status. But it also carried a second meaning, darker, heavier, a warning of what awaited her within. The last time Anne arrived at the Tower, 3 years earlier, the cannons had fired in celebration of her coronation procession. The fortress had welcomed her as the woman destined to reshape England. Now, they sounded for a different procession entirely, one that marked the beginning of her journey to the scaffold, the river behind her, the gates before her, and a future narrowing into darkness. The moment Anne set foot inside the Tower, the composure for which she had long been admired began to crumble. The woman who had once held herself with sharp intelligence and unshakable grace now fell to her knees, overwhelmed by fear and disbelief. Tears slipped from her eyes as she cried out her innocence, her voice cracking against the cold stone walls. She remembered painfully, vividly, that only 3 years earlier she had been welcomed here with full ceremony, the cannons firing in her honour as she prepared for her coronation. Now those same walls received her as a prisoner. The contrast pierced her like a blade. The Tower of London was a place of dual identities. royal residence, and infamous prison, a setting where triumph and terror lived side by side. This unsettling blend clouded Anne's thoughts. She had arrived here once as a queen, blessed by destiny. Now she arrived as a woman accused of treason. That dissonance alone might have been enough to unravel her, but the growing uncertainty, the sense that she no longer understood her own world, pushed her further toward despair. Responsibility for her detention now fell to Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower. He had served kings before, managed prisoners of all ranks, and understood better than most the fragile balance between mercy and authority. Anne, desperate and trembling, asked him whether she would be thrown into a dungeon. She feared the worst, the deep, damp cells known for breaking even the strongest will. But instead of turning toward the lower depths of the fortress, Kingston led her in the opposite direction. To her astonishment, Anne was escorted toward the Queen's lodgings, a set of chambers richly furnished, renovated at enormous cost by Henry himself for her coronation celebrations. These rooms had once symbolized triumph, splendor, and the promise of a new royal era. Now they stood as a melancholy echo of what she had been. Thanks to detailed Tudor maps preserved through the centuries, we know that these lodgings once stretched across the green lawn that lies empty today, connecting the White Tower to the outer wall. They were built for comfort, decorated with fine tapestries, panelled wood, and beds draped in luxurious fabric. When Anne saw the chambers, she gasped and exclaimed, "This place is too good for me." The meaning behind her words is uncertain. Was it a bitter remark, acknowledging the cruel irony of being housed in splendor while facing ruin? Was it a plea for pity, a self-effacing gesture meant to soften the hearts of those watching her? Or was it the bewildered utterance of a woman whose identity was slipping through her fingers? Kingston later recorded her behavior with a mixture of concern and detachment. He wrote that she wept heavily, then suddenly burst into laughter, an unsettling blend of emotions that suggested she was teetering on the edge of hysteria. It was as though shock had fractured something inside her, leaving her grasping for any response her mind could find. The silence of the tower, the weight of accusation, the echo of her own footsteps, everything pressed against her lungs, making each breath unsteady. Yet being placed in the Queen's chambers, rather than a dungeon, may have stirred a tiny ember of hope in her heart. Perhaps she wondered whether Henry intended to spare her. Perhaps she believed that such accommodations signalled hesitation, or even mercy. After all, she had not been forced into Traitor's Gate. She had not been cast into darkness. Henry had once loved her enough to reshape a kingdom. Could he not forgive her now? The Queen's lodgings, though gilded with memory, offered a flicker of comfort. Surrounded by the remnants of her former glory, Anne might have felt momentarily suspended between two fates, one leading toward redemption, one toward destruction. The velvet curtains, the carved furniture, the softness of the cushions might have whispered the possibility that she remained, in some fragile way, the rightful queen. But hope inside the tower was a dangerous thing. It warmed the heart only long enough to make the eventual cold more painful. Still, for this moment, this first terrible evening inside the fortress, Anne allowed herself to believe that perhaps not all was lost. That perhaps the king she had loved and fought for might yet recall the reasons he had chosen her. That perhaps the story was not yet finished. It was a gentle illusion, and illusions were often the tower's cruelest companions. Anne's chambers in the tower were richly furnished, but beneath their surface lay a snare woven with precision. The tapestries, the polished wood, the velvet cushions, all the comforts of royalty could not hide the fact that she was surrounded not by allies, but by watchers. She was assigned 4 ladies to attend her, yet every one of them was a woman she disliked or distrusted. Among them was even an aunt. Another reminder that in the world of the Boleyns, loyalty to the king eclipsed the bonds of blood. These 4 attendants were not chosen for their gentleness, nor for their loyalty to Anne. They were there because Thomas Cromwell placed them there. Their true purpose was not to serve, but to observe. They were spies in fine gowns, instructed to report every word Anne uttered, every gesture she made, even the tone of her breathing, if it suggested despair or guilt. Nothing she said within those chambers, not a whisper, not a sigh, would remain private. Cromwell understood that the case against Anne, though dramatic, was not yet strong enough. Accusations alone would not satisfy the legal and political structures he needed to navigate. He required details, confessions, inconsistencies, anything that could be twisted into evidence. And if Anne, in her distress, let slip a single phrase that could be interpreted as treason or impropriety, the 4 women stationed around her would hear it. They would carry it directly to Cromwell. Meanwhile, at Austin Friars, Cromwell was already contemplating the next stage of his plan. His experience with Catherine of Aragon had taught him a harsh but invaluable truth. It was not enough for a king to simply cast aside a queen. Catherine had resisted fiercely. For nearly 7 years, she refused to acknowledge the annulment of her marriage, and to the vast majority of the English people, she remained the rightful queen. Her dignity, her piety, her unwavering stance had made her a symbol, a rallying point for those opposed to Henry's decisions. Anne, though far less universally loved, still possessed powerful connections. She had supporters in the nobility, in foreign courts, and within the more reform-minded branches of the clergy. If Henry merely divorced or annulled his marriage to Anne, those supporters might challenge the action, undermine Henry's authority, or complicate his plans for the future. Cromwell had no intention of allowing another political quagmire like the one caused by Catherine. Thus he reached the conclusion that would determine Anne's fate. Anne could not simply be set aside. She had to be destroyed. She had to be transformed from queen into traitor, from wife into criminal. Only then would opposition collapse. Only then could Henry remarry without fear of backlash. Only then could history be rewritten without resistance. Inside Anne's chambers, the 4 women carried on their dual roles with silent diligence. They assisted her with dressing, attended her at meals, brought her water, and combed her hair, all while listening, always listening. They watched for signs of despair, noting each sharp breath, each tremble in her hands. They wrote down stray comments that might be twisted into admissions of guilt. The Queen's lodgings, once a symbol of her triumph, now became a place of suffocating surveillance. It must have felt like living inside a gilded cage. The bed was soft, but she could not sleep. The fire burned warmly, but offered no comfort. The tapestries on the wall, depicting scenes of royal splendor, now mocked her with reminders of what she had lost. She was wrapped in silk, yet stripped of freedom. Every sound in the corridor reminded her she was guarded. Every glance from her attendants reminded her she was watched. Every moment alone reminded her she was not truly alone at all. Cromwell's ears were everywhere, hidden in the presence of her own kin. Anne had always been quick-witted, always able to navigate the complexities of court life. But this was different. In the Tower, her world had shrunk into a single suite of rooms, where every gesture could be weaponized. The walls themselves seemed to lean closer, listening. And so the Queen's chamber, built as a sanctuary of luxury, became something far more unsettling. A prison carved in velvet, a cage lined with gold, a place where hope flickered faintly, and fear grew with each passing hour. Across London, rumours spread quickly, carried from tavern to market stall, from whisper to whisper, until they reached even the most distant corners of the city. The latest murmur was the most shocking of all. The mysterious 3rd man accused of committing adultery with Anne was said to be her own brother, George Boleyn. This accusation, more grotesque than anything yet spoken, ignited a wave of horror and fascination among the people. It was precisely the kind of rumour Cromwell needed, a spark that could grow into a fire capable of consuming Anne's reputation entirely. When the news reached George, panic seized him. He rushed to Whitehall, desperate to see the king. In his mind, he believed that if he could only speak to Henry, if he could stand before the man who had once been almost a brother-in-law in affection, he could clear his name and perhaps protect his sister. But he arrived only to find that the palace doors had closed to him. The Whitehall of that time no longer stands. Its place is now filled with modern buildings. But in the spring of the year 1536, the palace was a labyrinth of power, and Cromwell controlled every corridor. Cromwell had already sealed Henry behind a wall of advisers and loyal guards. No friend, no courtier, no member of the Boleyn family would be permitted near the king. George never reached Henry's presence. Instead, before he could even plead his case, he was arrested on the spot. Soldiers closed around him like jaws snapping shut. And then came the charge, not merely adultery, but incest with his sister, the Queen. The addition of this accusation transformed the narrative entirely. What had begun as claims of adultery already treasonous, for a queen now spiraled into something monstrous, something designed to turn stomachs and harden hearts. It painted Anne not only as unfaithful, but as morally corrupted, depraved beyond redemption. As Cromwell well understood, public opinion could be shaped like clay, and nothing turned people more swiftly than disgust. Incest was not only a sin, it was an abomination. By tying George into the allegations, Cromwell crafted a story that made Anne's downfall seem not merely justified, but inevitable. Thus the circle tightened. 3 men now stood accused alongside Anne: Sir Henry Norris, the king's trusted friend, Mark Smeaton, a common musician, and George Boleyn, her own brother. Their social differences, nobleman, servant, sibling, made the accusations seem simultaneously broad and plausible. If guilt could be found among such varied ranks, it made Anne appear capable of anything. But beyond the strategic weight of these arrests, something deeper was unfolding. Cromwell was not only gathering defendants, he was dismantling Anne's defences. Each of these men, in their own way, had been part of her support structure. Norris had admired and respected her. Smeaton, though of low birth, had been drawn into her household and into the circles of influence she commanded. George had been her closest ally, intellectually and emotionally, sharing her political ambition and her reformist spirit. By removing them, Cromwell left Anne isolated, friendless, and symbolically broken. Throughout this orchestrated unravelling, the political nature of the entire process grew unmistakably clear. Every decision, every accusation, every dramatic twist was part of a carefully staged performance. It was not simply a legal case, it was a narrative, a construction of meaning delivered to the public in pieces, ensuring that by the time the trial began, the audience would already know their lines. They would look upon Anne and not see a woman betrayed by her king, but a queen who had betrayed her king. They would enter the courtroom ready to believe she was dangerous, immoral, treasonous. Cromwell designed it that way. A trial, after all, was not only a place to judge the truth, it was a place to unveil a story the public had already been prepared to accept. And in the story being built step by step, scene by scene, Anne Boleyn was cast not as a tragic figure, but as a villain whose fall was already written. With George's arrest, the narrative gained its darkest chapter yet. The political theatre tightened its grip, and Anne's world, already shaken, began to collapse completely. As Cromwell continued his preparations for what would soon be called the trial of the century, he tightened his grip around every thread connected to Anne. From Austin Friars to the Tower of London lay only a short stretch of the city, but symbolically it was the distance between a chamber of calculation and a place of waiting for death. Cromwell's work at Austin Friars was all strategy. The Tower was where the consequences of that strategy would fall. He had already imprisoned Sir Henry Norris, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn, each accused of adultery with the Queen. Their arrests served 2 purposes: to support the narrative of Anne's guilt and to strip her of every ally who might defend her. With the men in custody, Cromwell's next objective was to create a trial whose outcome was practically predetermined. A trial that appeared lawful, orderly, and dignified, yet beneath its polished surface, every verdict, every charge, every word spoken had already been carefully shaped. Inside the Tower, Anne faced her first night as a prisoner. The physical comfort of her chambers could not soften the terror that crept over her. Her thoughts spiraled through fear, disbelief, and a fragile hope that still fluttered, faint but persistent. Her mood was visibly deteriorating. She paced, wept, and tried to steady herself, though her mind felt pulled in too many directions at once. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, came to speak with her. He was responsible for her confinement, but he was not a cruel man. He observed her with the calm professionalism expected of someone who had overseen the imprisonment of nobles before. Anne clung to him as a source of information, perhaps hoping for clarity or even comfort. She repeated what she had insisted earlier to the Privy Council, that she was the king's lawful wife. Her voice was strained but determined, as though repeating this truth might somehow protect her. Then she asked Kingston the question that had been echoing inside her since her arrest. Did he know why she had been brought here? Kingston replied that he did not. Whether that was honesty or a necessary lie, no one could say. Perhaps he truly did not know the depth of Cromwell's accusations, or perhaps he understood that any truth he offered would only worsen her despair. Anne's desperation grew. She asked after those who had always stood by her, particularly her father, Thomas Boleyn. She wanted reassurance that he was fighting for her, that he was petitioning the king, that he was refusing to abandon his daughter. But the reality, cold and unyielding, was that Thomas Boleyn had already withdrawn into silence. Fear for his own life and status outweighed paternal duty. He could not or would not oppose Cromwell's rising tide. In choosing self-preservation, he left Anne more alone than she had ever been. Meanwhile, at Whitehall, Henry retired to his chambers alone. His wife, the woman he had once defied nations for, was imprisoned, and the palace that had once echoed with their ambition now held only his solitary footsteps. Throughout the day he had maintained a veneer of calm, even cheerfulness, distracting himself with feasts, conversations, and the company of other women. But when Cromwell's detailed report of accusations reached him that night, something shifted. According to accounts from those near him, Henry wept as he read the charges. Tears slid down the face of the king, who had once celebrated Anne's triumphs and now presided over her ruin. But were those tears genuine? Did they reflect sorrow for Anne or sorrow for himself? This question has lingered for centuries. Some have imagined Henry grieving the collapse of a love he had once believed in. Others, including Tracy, suggest something more complicated, that Henry's tears were not for Anne at all, but for the man he believed himself to be. A man who had chosen Anne, elevated her, reshaped England, for her only to feel betrayed by her alleged infidelity. In this interpretation, the tears were not a sign of empathy, but of wounded pride. The king, who had gambled everything on Anne, now felt humiliated by the idea that she might have deceived him. Thus his sorrow, if it can be called sorrow, was a twisted, self-focused grief, the grief of a man who saw himself as the injured party. Back in the Tower, Anne knew nothing of Henry's tears, real or imagined. She knew only the silence of the stone walls and the growing sense that her world had tilted irrevocably. As night settled over London, she lay awake in the chambers once meant to honour her, listening to the faint footsteps in the corridor and wondering whether dawn would bring mercy or destruction. The machinery of her downfall was already in motion, and Cromwell, ever patient, was tightening every bolt. Night settled over the Tower of London, with a heaviness that seemed almost alive, as though the ancient stones themselves exhaled the weight of centuries. Shadows stretched long across the courtyards, and the murmurs of guards faded into the kind of silence that presses against the ribs. It was in this atmosphere, thick with dread, with memory, with the whispered legends of ghosts, that Anne found herself utterly alone in the Queen's lodgings. Though her chambers were still furnished with the luxury befitting a queen, the air inside them felt cold, hollow, stripped of comfort. Silk curtains whispered faintly with each draught, and the gilded carvings on the walls seemed to shrink away from her. Here, surrounded by reminders of her brief glory, she confronted the unbearable uncertainty of what awaited her. Sleep would not come. Hope flickered weakly. But fear of the unknown, of betrayal, of death pressed more tightly around her than any velvet mantle. It was during this long, suffocating night that one of the most famous letters in Tudor history was said to have been written. A letter attributed to Anne, addressed to Henry, composed from within the Tower. Whether every word is truly hers remains debated, but the emotions carried in its lines feel strikingly real, a mixture of pride, desperation, and lingering belief in justice. In the letter, Anne pleaded, "Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges, for my truth shall fear no open shame." These words, delicate yet fierce, were the voice of a woman who refused to bow completely to despair. She was frightened, yes, she was overwhelmed, but she still held to the idea that truth, her truth, might prevail. Even as Cromwell's machinery tightened around her, even as accusations multiplied, she believed a fair trial could save her. The letter revealed her faith not in Henry's love, which had already vanished, but in the rule of law she hoped he would honour. It was the final echo of the woman Henry had once adored. Intelligent, articulate, unwavering in her sense of dignity. Yet Anne could not know that the trial she begged for had already been shaped, moulded, manipulated, long before she entered the courtroom. Her enemies, sworn, powerful, and numerous, were already in place. The charges were ready. The outcome was all but inscribed in stone. The Tower walls, if they could speak, might have told her the truth, that no lawful trial awaited her, only a performance crafted for politics, for spectacle, for the satisfaction of a king who wished to rewrite his past. But in this moment, this fragile, trembling moment, she still believed. She paced the room, her steps muffled by thick rugs. Sometimes she sat motionless, staring into the darkened corners where the flickering candlelight couldn't reach. Sometimes she whispered prayers under her breath. Outside, a distant bell told the hours. Inside, she held tightly to the idea that justice, however faint, might still be within reach. The episode of her story ends with a question suspended in the air. Would Anne receive the fair trial she begged for? History, of course, provides the answer. She was executed on the 19th of May. Her trial, swift, biased, and devastating, sealed her fate long before she walked into the courtroom. But the structure of the narrative lingers on that moment in her chamber, on the plea written into the shadows of the tower, allowing us to feel the ache of what she felt. Because in that room, while the city slept and the river whispered below the walls, Anne Boleyn still hoped. She still believed that truth could triumph, that justice could withstand politics, that her husband might yet remember the woman he once loved. It is that hope, fragile, misguided, heartbreakingly human, that remains suspended in the dark long after the candle in her chamber burned out. And as the final notes fade, the viewer is left with a tightness in the throat, knowing what Anne could not. That hope, for her, was already slipping away. As the story slowly comes to a close, let the images that have passed begin to soften, like the final ripples on the surface of the Thames as evening settles in. Imagine the warm golden light gently spreading across the ancient walls of the Tower of London, where Anne Boleyn once endured the longest night of her life. And then, just as the night embraces the city, we allow the story to drift quietly into the distance, as gently as a breath. Anne stepped into history not only because of her tragedy, but because of the message her life leaves behind. That power, no matter how high, is as fragile as glass. That even the strongest hearts can be swept away by the winds of ambition and circumstance. And that human beings, whether kings or queens, carry within them fear, hope, and a longing to be understood. Anne was not only a fallen queen, she is a reminder that behind the darkness of grand palaces, there are still small, beating souls trying to hold on to what they believe is right. Now, let your shoulders relax and allow the quiet that flows from this story to settle around you. The sounds of that distant court fade one by one, the water brushing against the side of a boat, footsteps on damp stone, even the whisper of letters that never reached their intended hands, all drifting away, leaving behind a space that feels soft, peaceful, and still. Let your mind rest in the knowledge that although the story was filled with storms, it also carries a gentle truth, that pride, honesty, and faith in justice, even when crushed, remain small lanterns that keep the darkness from swallowing everything. And sometimes, simply keeping those lanterns alive inside ourselves is enough to help us walk through the long days of our own lives. So now, allow your eyes to close as lightly as petals. Let your breathing slow, round, and warm. And let the story of a queen who lived, who loved, who fought, and who hoped lull you gently towards sleep. I wish you a very good night, deep and restful. And if you would like to continue this journey with us, these soft stories, these quiet pieces of history whispered into the dark, feel free to subscribe so you won't miss any of our newest and best videos. Wishing you a peaceful night. Until we meet again in the next dream.